Hello and welcome to a new YouTube video. This video is gonna be in the style of the one where I talk about the best weapons for a fantasy traveler, which was kind of in response to Shediversity's multiple videos about that same topic. And this video I would like to talk a little bit about one of my favorite book series, and it's basically a fantasy rearmed, because I'm going to discuss the weapons and tools used by the people in this book series and discuss whether or not they should be maybe change their loadout, basically. So the book series I'm talking about is Ranger's Apprentice, and if you haven't read the book series, or at least some or few of the books, this video is not going to be very interesting. It might be a bit. I'm going to explain what sort of people I'm talking about, so try to follow along if you haven't read the books. So, what are the Rangers? The Rangers is basically a force under the king, which are basically spies and the eyes and ears of the kingdom. They go on missions where they infiltrate behind enemy lines. They gather information, then they send messages, they sabotage the enemy's plans. They're basically a secrecy, a force that works in secrecy, kind of like the FBI or some form of secret operative force. So what are their weapons? They use big and heavy longbows. They are kind of inspired by medieval Englishmen, and so they have big beefy longbows, and they have which shoot arrows, of course. And then they have the tools that I'm going to question a bit. They use two knives, or two daggers. They have a small one to begin with. I'm guessing somewhere around this size. This is my bushcrafting knife, which is their basic tool. And then they have a bigger knife. Now I think canonically it would be a little longer than this one, and I'm not sure. A lot of people on the internet are calling the long knife a sax, and a sax is a knife used a lot by the Vikings. I think it originates in the Frankish kingdom. I'm not sure about this, but I think I've heard something along those lines. It's not exactly this shape, but kind of. It's a broken back, and it's basically a big knife that were used a lot by Vikings. So a lot of people on the internet say that the Ranger's big knife is a sax, but I haven't actually noticed anywhere in the books that they actually say it is a sax knife. So it can very well be another blade shape or another style of knife. But the thing that I know is that it's a pretty long knife, and they carry these in a double sheath on their side like this. So what's the premise of this video? It is basically that they should use swords. I think a sword would be a better piece of equipment for the Rangers. So there is a Ranger in the books, his name is Gillen, who actually has a sword. I don't know for sure if it is a one-handed or two-handed sword. If it is a one-handed, that's stupid, and I'm going to get to that. But yeah, he has a sword, and basically Gillen is my favorite character because of that fact. I discussed this a little bit on Reddit, and I got a lot of criticism about this. There were a lot of people who had different thoughts, and saying no, swords wouldn't be a good piece of equipment for them. The knives are better. And so I'm going to basically bring up one of the counter arguments and then try to answer it, basically. And so I will start with the points I thought at least had some validity, and then in the end I'm going to go through some of the ones that are just completely bullshit. The first one, mobility and sneaking around. So basically the Rangers rely very heavily on stealth. They have camouflaged cloaks that help them stay hidden, basically, and well, a big part of their operation is to stay hidden, because they often work behind enemy lines and they need to be able to stay unnoticed. So the point is basically a sword like this would be a hindrance for sneaking around. And my first thought is, well, yes, sure, it would maybe be a hindrance. You know, it could wave around, it could hit things. So yeah, it is a valid point. But the thing is, wouldn't a longbow be though? Because this is kind of a flaw in the book, in my opinion, that they have these big longbows. This is not a bow, this is just a staff, but it's for representation. A big longbow, how are they carrying it? I think they carry it on their backs. I have tried carrying bows this way myself, and it's not a very good way to carry them, if I say so. And then they have quivers with arrows. I think it's 24 arrows or something. I think they're carrying the quivers on their backs in the books. That doesn't work very well. They should be carrying them on their sides, but either way, however they carry the bow, it's going to be a hindrance for them when they're trying to sneak around. So basically what's happening in the books is that they have their gear with them on their horses, and that's another very important part of their repertoire or their gear, is that they use horses or ponies. And so basically they have their full loadout on their ponies, and then if they think they need to go into stealth mode basically and go really close to an enemy, they will basically leave their bows on their horses, and their horses are specially trained to stay quiet, stay hidden, not let anyone else ride on them, and so on and so forth. So basically, if the Rangers know that they need to be extra stealthy, they will leave their bows. And I think the exact same can be done with their swords if they had. They could even have their swords on their horses. They don't even need to carry them in their belts. They can be on the horses in their scabbards. And so that's my solution to that counter argument, basically. Next counter argument is that the Rangers would very rarely need swords, and this has validity to it as well. Their primary weapon is their bow, and they're going to try to stay out of range of their enemies as often as they possibly can. And so how often would the swords actually be useful? Not very often, but swords aren't very hard to bring with you even if you don't carry it. In fact, it was the pocket pick for self-defense in medieval times. Anyone who had a sword would happily carry it all the time, both because it was very prestigious and a status symbol, but also because it's perfectly good self-defense without being too cumbersome or getting in the way. It's convenient to carry, basically. So and the Rangers are also all about being prepared for all sorts of situations, and so I don't think they would think twice about carrying swords, because it is not as much as a hindrance as some people might suggest, and it's a better last-ditch weapon than 2 knives. So I think that at least a lot of Rangers would prefer to carry swords. Even though they wouldn't be used as often, when an enemy manages to overrun them, maybe their bow has broken, maybe there are just too many enemies that run them over, they would want a good last-ditch close quarters weapon, which the daggers are not, and I will get into that later as well. The next point that got brought up, and this was the first one that I really thought, well, that's actually a good point, and it's that with a sword, the Rangers are immediately noticeable warriors. Anyone that sees them will see their swords and basically know, well, they're warriors and they have some form of wealth or status because they have swords. And so with knives, the Rangers could pass off as merely hunters. That's a valid point. However, it doesn't happen very often in the books. Their dual sheath with 2 knives are already very unusual and get noticed by a lot of people in the books, as well as their unusual cloaks, which are which some villagers and people in the books almost view as magical because they are such good camouflage. The Rangers can sort of blend in with the environment, and people basically assume that they're some sort of wizard. So I don't think it is a good point, but it's not a strong enough point to nullify sword carrying, because, as I said, how often would they need to pass off as hunters? Don't they already pass off as pretty damn good warriors and pretty darn unusual, pretty noticeable when they're not trying to sneak around, of course? So it is a valid point, but it's a very small valid point. The next point is that swords take more training. And at first I'm thinking, yeah, swords take training to fight with effectively, but they are already training in dagger fighting, and I would argue that it is harder to defend yourself with 2 daggers, and if you're going to beat someone with a longer weapon than you with using two daggers, it takes more skill and more training, and not even that. It's a horrible matchup. Learning to use 2 daggers as effective weapons would take at least as much training as getting good with a sword. So people say that if they're using swords, then their apprentice period would be doubled, and their training, they would have to train a lot more. And Gillen in the books already knew sword fighting before he became a ranger, and he only was taught sword fighting because his father was a great sword fighter, and basically he got a sword in his hand at like age 7 or something. So yeah, I think it would increase the training period a little bit, because you would want to be good with your sword, of course. But since dagger fighting would be removed, and since defending yourself with daggers is significantly harder than defending yourself with a sword, I think it's kind of plus minus 0. It's basically negligible, in my opinion. And then the last point that I thought had some validity to it is that the knives that they are carrying are not a weapon of theirs. They are primarily tools, bushcrafting tools, and not weapons. And I thought, yeah, okay. Their main weapon is their bow, and they are going to try to stay behind their bow at all times, basically, and stay out of range of their enemies' melee weapons. But if the occasion happens that they are overrun, they can use their bushcrafting tools as weapons. But that brings up another thing, and it's that why do they then have 2 knives? Because I enjoy hiking, and when hiking you want to travel light, and so you don't want to bring too much gear. And so I have had long thoughts and discussions with myself, basically, what tools I should carry, because one part of me wants to carry my favorite knife, and I also want to carry a small hatchet and like a Victorinox, and then it's like I have too much stuff that fulfills too much of a similar role. And so that's basically my argument. 2 knives of different sizes, the smaller ones still being kind of big, they serve 2 similar purposes. Their area of usage are too interlocked, they're too close, and so it's ineffective to have 2 of them. They should rather have a medium-sized one that can do most of the things that the bigger one can and most of the things that the smaller one can, and that also removes the unusualness of the dual sheath that they have that draws attention to it, and they would really be able to pass off as hunters if they only had 1 medium-sized knife. And so that brings up a whole other argument, because if you're viewing the knives as tools rather than weapons, then there's no need to carry 2. You're carrying, they should be carrying only 1. And so I could buy that. I could say, well, 2 daggers are not the best repertoire for them. They should either choose carrying a small knife and a sword, or a medium-sized knife. And that's the end of the points with validity to them. And now I'm going to go into the ones that I was just completely baffled by because they're so stupid. Number 1, that daggers are in fact good self-defense. No, it's not. A dagger against any weapon that is longer than itself, that is short swords, long swords, spears, polearms, basically everything other than a knife, a dagger is going to be shorter than, and it's going to be weaker than hatchets and blunt weapons and all that sort of stuff. So they're basically arguing that with 2 knives you can put up 1, but only 1 wouldn't be enough to block a sword strike, so you put up the other one as bracing, and this is something that they actually do in the books. This is fantasy, this is fiction. A sword fighter doesn't wildly flail around the sword and just go for a big swing from above that you can easily block like this and then go in and stab them, which happens in the books. That's fiction. It's not realistic. A skilled sword fighter, they go for quick strikes from multiple angles that would be hard to parry with anything, let alone hard to parry with daggers. Oh shit, I have low battery. And they also say in the books that they have a friend named Horace who is a knight, and so basically Gillen says to Horace that if you're going against someone with a dagger, go for thrusts, because thrusts are basically impossible to parry with knives. You can try to deflect the blow, the thrust, and you can try to step out of the way, but what I'm trying to say is daggers are a horrible matchup against swords. And they also try to justify daggers because of their unusualness. That goes against the other argument that they are able to pass off as hunters. That they're basically saying that two daggers are so unusual that they are caught off guard by this very simple crisscross block, so that the rangers basically have a free kill on every new enemy. That's bullshit. Anyone can figure out with the rear end that this is how you block with two knives. And then other people are trying to tell me that yeah, maybe they could use swords, but only one-handed swords. And this is enraging me somewhat, okay? A two-handed sword is not a big or cumbersome weapon, contrary to popular belief. They are slightly heavier than one-handed swords, and we're talking less than half a kilogram. It's almost negligible. And also you're using it with two hands, which is basically each of your hands has a lighter weight in them each than they would if you were using a one-handed sword that was slightly lighter. And also, let's say you're a ranger and you're using your bow and you have to drop it, you're overrun or your bow is broken or whatever, and then you draw your sword and it's a one-handed sword. What the fuck are you doing with your other hand? If they had a knife, they could dual wield, but a knife compared to something like a shield is bad defense. And so since they don't want to carry shields, if you think that swords are bad for sneaking around, just imagine what a shield would be. And so one-handed weapons are almost always paired with a shield. One-handed axes, one-handed swords, like the Viking style Ulfbert swords, the gladius, the Roman gladius, they were all paired with a shield, because with a shield you don't really need the extra reach of a longsword. You can block your enemy's weapon with your shield, get in with your shorter weapon, and behind the shield a shorter weapon is easier to maneuver and all that sort of stuff. So since the rangers don't carry shields, they would want to be able to hold their sword with two hands. A one-handed sword is absolutely off the table. Another thing that they're saying is that the daggers works as throwing weapons. They say, okay, if they can't use their bow, then they have they need two knives because they can throw one of them and then have one as defense. Well, then you're throwing away the bracing that you just praised, and then throwing knives aren't good. It's fiction again. People really needs to stop loving throwing knives, because it's a bad weapon. You can only use it once. It's really bad against anyone with some sort of armor. You're throwing away, you're literally throwing away your weapon, and you have no weapon left. If you want to have some sort of ranger that uses throwing weapons, it should be something of this size. It should be a small, easily forged throwing knives that you can have multiple of in pockets. So you can throw multiple, you can dispense with them. Still, they wouldn't be very good weapons, but at least that would be better than throwing away half of your backup defense. And then some schmuck tried to say that archers don't carry swords. They do. In medieval times, swords were excellent for archers because they are out of the way, they're convenient and easy to carry when you're using your bow. And then when you can't use your bow anymore, it's good self-defense that you can use both of your hands. And so for archers, swords were a good pick. If they could afford it, that is to say. And then the worst ones. Two-handed swords are too big and heavy and cumbersome for a ranger that needs to be light on their feet and they are small builds and just stop it. This isn't Dungeons and Dragons where swords weigh this much and only a person with 10 strength can carry them. Swords are actually quite light and nimble weapons. And as I said, long swords are barely heavier than one-handed swords, with the extra benefit of about a feet of blade, which you would want in a close quarters situation. In close quarters, you want every centimeter of reach that you can get. So that's my premise, basically. I think that swords could be good picks for the Rangers. If they would carry swords, they would also carry a small bushcrafting knife. Of course, they need that. If they don't want to carry swords for easier travel or easier sneaking ability, they would carry only one knife and not two. But that doesn't really matter because the horse can carry the sword and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, if you enjoyed this video, I actually kind of enjoy doing these kinds of weapons, and I am thinking about doing a more proper fantasy rearmed video in the style of Shadiversity, where I talk about the ranger generally, the fantasy ranger, and what weapons would be suitable for a fantasy ranger, rather than only the Rangers in Rangers Apprentice, the book series. And so if you want to see that, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.